Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to all of you who have joined us in this exceptional Zoom event in the honor of Étienne Balibar, who is with us here today. We're going to be receiving the Award for Critical Engagement of the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory and the Center for Advanced Studies of the University of Rijeka. I'm just going to be introducing the various speakers, the initial speakers, before Étienne Balibar will speak. Stephen Sawyer, the director of the Center for Critical Democracy Studies here at the American University of Paris, will speak after me. I'm a professor myself here in this university. He will be followed by Sanja Bojanić, who is professor and executive director of the Center for Advanced Studies at the University of Rijeka. Then the award will be presented by Gazela, Pudar, Draško, who is the director of the Institute of Philosophy and Social Studies in Belgrade, that we're very happy to host here today, who will then be followed by Étienne Balibar himself. Following Étienne Balibar's remarks, there will be some brief remarks by Petar, who I'm also very pleased to have with us here today, who is brought from the Institute of Advanced Studies at the University of Rijeka and the Institute of Philosophy and Social Theory at Belgrade. The moderator for this event will be Zona Zaric, who is at the École Normale Supérieure here in Paris, and a member of the Institute of Philosophy and Social Theory of the University of Belgrade, as well as an alumna of the American University of Paris. So it fits all of these relevant things. And so I wish you an excellent conference with Étienne Balibar. Stephen, you now have the floor. Thank you all for being here.
I'd just like to say very briefly, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. My name is Stephen Sawyer, as Professor Philip Golub just mentioned. I'm the director of the Center for Critical Democracy Studies here at the American University of Paris. So I'd like to begin, just open the evening with a special thanks to the colleagues and friends who have made this event possible. A particularly warm and deep thanks to the present director, Gazela, Pudar, Draško, who is here, and former director, Petar, Bojanić, of the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory at the University of Belgrade, who will be in a moment bestowing the Miladin Životić Prize on Étienne Balibar, who is here on my left. You have made this event possible, and I thank you. I would also like to thank the Center for Advanced Studies in Southeast Europe, the University of Rijeka, for their support. And of course, this event would not have happened were it not for the extraordinary Zona Zaric, presently at the UNS and a former MA graduate from the American University of Paris, and our very own Professor Philip Golub, in the Department of History and Politics here at the American University of Paris. It is a great honor and a pleasure to hold this event at the Center for Critical Democracy Studies. Professor Balibar's talk, What is Engagement?, is inaugurating the Center's initiative for 2021, what we are titling DEMOS21. DEMOS21 will be a series of lectures taking place across the coming year during the spring and the fall semesters of 21, treating essential questions of contemporary and future democratic life. The list is indeed long of the processes that are profoundly reshaping the collective foundations of our contemporary democracies. This convocation, including lectures on race and law, contemporary European democratic theory, the digital demos, and the possibilities of a democratic diplomacy, among others, will investigate how we build political and social solidarity within, beyond, and below the scale of the nation state to confront these essential challenges. What shape will the public's vital to dynamic democratic life take in the decades to come? In short, the question, what demos for the 21st century? Speaking across languages, across cultures, across disciplines, and across media, the series begins here this evening with Étienne Balibar, who is asking us to reflect with him on the contours and perhaps even possibilities of engagement in our contemporary context. I cannot think of a more fitting topic to honor the memory of Miladin Životić and to launch our shared reflections on the transformations of the demos in the 21st century. Thank you, Étienne Balibar, for accepting this invitation and for sharing your thoughts with us this afternoon. With that, I'd like to pass the floor to my colleagues from the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory at the University of Belgrade.
Excuse me, I'm here. It's the University of Rijeka, it's Center for Advanced Studies. And I want to salute you all. Bonjour Étienne, ça fait plaisir de vous voir tous ensemble. J'espère que vous m'entendez bien.
I can't see you, which is extremely frustrating.
C'est pas grave, hein? On le fera une autre fois. It's my honor actually to say just a few words how the prize Miladin Životić started to be attributed, and it happened in Rijeka in 2018, and it was on occasion of the summer school and conference that we've had with Judith Butler in Rijeka. We spoke about critique of violence now, from thinking to acting against violence. In June 2018, next year, the prize was attributed to Axel Honneth in Belgrade, and this year we meant to meet in Rijeka in March, but well, unfortunately this didn't happen. So with no more talking and no pictures, I just let you continue your work here. We are in Rijeka very happy to listen and follow the lecture you are going to propose to us. Thank you.
The host muted everyone, so this is a good start for this. Well, thank you very much for having us here today. I'm really pleased to be able to travel in spite of the circumstances to be here today. I'm speaking now on behalf of the whole team of the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory. It's a great honor to be today. It's a great honor to have this award given to Étienne Balibar. I think I need to say just a few words about Miladin Životić, as I think the way how Sanja started Rijeka, with Sanja actually how the award started Rijeka, and the topic we started and the topic that we have today with us tells very much about Miladin Životić, about his engagement, about the person whom we chose to give a name to our award, among many other founders which we have at our institute. And the institute is a specific institution in our environment in former Yugoslavia, as institute given one president of Yugoslavia, given one prime minister who was unfortunately assassinated, given one president of parliament. All them were somehow connected to praxis school, but we have chosen to give to this award the name Miladin Životić, because he was a symbol of everything which we actually see through these speeches which are given connected to award, from the violence or struggle against violence to the engagement that we have today. Miladin Životić stays with us as a person who embodied engagement in very own intellectual way, and as a person who gave a personal example how to fight against violence and how to fight against war. And that's the reason why we've chosen him, and that's the reason why we decided that Institute established an award which is named by his name. I think that having in mind everything what we survived in the previous, let's say, 2 years with struggling for academic freedom in Serbia, being able to succeed at least at this point with the support of our friends, with the support of Étienne Balibar, to whom I sincere thanks once more, with the support of Philip Golub, who really, together with Zona, invested a lot of efforts in helping us to raise, to collect more people from the international community, and whose name really helped us to survive and to continue our work further. And I hope that this just went, which is showing that our work is worth of that support. So thank you very much. And with this, I have this small piece of award, which is produced by a colleague from Rijeka, actually, and which I give to Étienne.
And I can even give you a hug.
Yes, unfortunately, that's true. It's completely un-French, I would say, but we are honored that you can have it.
Thank you so much. And does the camera? This is okay. So for everybody to see with your signature. Thank you, Gazela.
Thank you.
Deeply. Is it my turn?
Yes, it is.
It's your turn now, and we are eager to hear.
Okay, so the first thing I want to say, of course, is that the awarding of this prize, I guess, the second or perhaps the third I received in my lifetime. I mean, in matters of international prizes is a great honor for me. It's very moving to me. It's a great honor, of course, because of what you recall, the name of the public and intellectual figure after whom it is created, or in whose memory it is created, and the names of my colleagues, the other philosophers who received it before me, and I find, of course, myself elevated to be in their company. So I thank you very deeply and very gratefully, Gazela, Petar, all your colleagues in Belgrade and Rijeka as well. And now, if you allow me, of course, I will try and say something on the theme that has been proposed to our consideration, I would say, for today's lecture and discussion. Now, what I see in front of me, a part of a few friends in this room, is an electronic eye or light, which is friendly to some extent, but also, of course, a little strange. And if you allow me, I will address the invisible audience, thanking all those who, from what I've said, are now before their screens, or I don't know if they remain until the end, but at least they are here for the beginning of the session. I try to imagine them because, of course, as an old professor in the Western tradition, more accustomed to speaking before real audiences than before invisible ones. Although in the last period, of course, I have begun to accustom myself to teaching online. But when you teach online, you see yourself on the little screen and you see at least part of the audience. I mean, like little faces, like little Leibnizian monads in small boxes on your screen. Whereas here, I mean, it's really, it's really totally blind in a sense, and therefore I have to make an effort of imagination. I do that with great pleasure, and I thank you all enormously for it. I think they're nice, and Philip, I think everyone is over. Okay, so engagement or in fact, as I will explain in a few minutes, engagement, because there's a problem of translation or transposition, I would say here. And I'm not coming with full text, I'm coming with notes from which I will try to elaborate or improvise to some extent, which is partly due to the fact that in this moment many things are disturbed, and especially the calendar and the schedule, which allows you to prepare for a talk like this one. But also thinking more about it while I was precisely putting these notes on paper, because as every professor of philosophy who's been teaching for years and years, of course, I had many occasions to address this notion or this issue, to even teach lessons about it. But when I found myself a few days ago, before the task of talking today, I realized that I should start again from scratch, in a sense. And that, and this was due in part, as I will recall in a bit, to the fact that I was also asked to give this talk in English, which is not a possible task for me because I've been teaching classes in English for quite a bit of time now, but brutally, in a sense, dislocated or unsettled, I would say, my habits, and made me realize that, in a sense, the correspondence between engagement and engagement in French might cover some interesting riddles. And therefore, of course, I started ruminating about these riddles, and I soon got to the conclusion that I could offer only very preliminary remarks. Now, there are even some preliminaries to the preliminaries, and in fact, two of them. So the first, very quickly, is that unfortunate that there are a few people here. I can see you at least. The first is that to speak about engagement, allow me to shift to the French name inserted into the English discourse, especially for an intellectual, but perhaps not only for an intellectual, or rather, and I will try to come to that in a minute. One of the questions hiding behind these formulas is a question about what we could, how we could define the boundaries of intellectuality, which perhaps, in fact, ought to be considered from today's perspective as a completely open and an unbounded realm. And in any case, certainly it does not coincide with status, a professor, journalist, and so on, or a profession. Of course, the German category of Beruf, which Max Weber famously used in his own considerations on the subject that we are going to deal today, is more relevant from this point of view, because, as we know, when we want to translate the Beruf into either French or English, we are forced to combine references to the idea of a status, precisely, or profession. There are intellectual or scientific professions in our academic institutions and otherwise, and also, of course, something sometimes translated as a calling or a vocation in French, which takes us closer to the idea of engagement. But what I want to say, sorry for using around a little bit, is that to speak about engagement is inevitably to speak and therefore also to reflect, to meditate almost, to ruminate perhaps about oneself and one's self, one's history, one's life, one's actions, one's achievements perhaps, but above all, and I return to that, one's errors, one's failures, one's mistakes. Therefore, of course, engagement is or will have been at the hour of assessing the final balancing account, something that can be referred to only in the first person. Now, I immediately need to qualify this or to be clearer about what the first person means, the subject in the first person, if you like. If we follow the grammatical guiding threads here, we may think, of course, of the very famous theorists of enunciation in different persons, such as Bojanić. Of course, the first person is not only the singular. First person is the singular, or it is the plural, or as I would suggest in my little personal terminology, which is part of my, what's the problem?
Excusez-moi.
Non, je vous en prie.
C'est juste pour vérifier, les gens
Yes.
ont un peu de mal à vous entendre.
Oh, okay. So what should I do?
C'est ça la question, c'est comment...
Because I'm not very happy with the idea of standing behind.
Non, il faut pas. Il faut
I
je veux dire, il faut que vous soyez confortable. Donc, vous restez comme ça, parlez un peu dans le micro. Mais c'est pas ça. Vous faites comme vous voulez.
Okay, I could shout. I continue. Thank you, Steve, for your help. So, in my terminology, I would say the first person could be trans-individual and not purely individualistic. And in a sense, I know of no better formula to immediately express this than the extraordinary statement that you find in Hegel's phenomenology of the mind or the spirit, depending on translations, at the end of the introductory section in the great chapter on self-consciousness, which is famous for its developments on master and slave dialectic or the unhappy consciousness, where Hegel, after explaining it first in abstract terms, that self-consciousness only exists through the introduction of a double with whom the self is somehow in a situation of dialogue, and that could be also antagonism, of course, and that has to be antagonism, so that a process of recognition is starting from the very beginning of this dialectic. He eventually puts into brackets or after a column what you could call the say of the spirit. And what does the spirit say in Hegel's terms? This very strange formula. It doesn't say cogito, or it doesn't say cogitamus, but it says I, that is we, and we, that is I. And of course, this covers many problems, but I tend to believe that in the idea of engagement, this reciprocity of the I and the we is inevitably at stake, if not always already involved. Now, my second preliminary to the preliminaries, and there will be only preliminaries in this speech, a great master, of course, of that style, whom I would never dare to compare myself to, was my professor Jacques Derrida, who was also Petar, Bojanić professor, who could speak 3 hours or 4 hours introducing so as you can see, I use the French word engagement, and I will continue to do so. And why is that? Now, allow me to refer briefly to a brilliant essay that has been written some time ago by one of our hosts today. This is Petar Bojanić. It's published, I believe, in a volume with Springer. You said to me, you give the title later, but the title of your essay is "What is an Act of Engagement?" and subtitle "Between the Social, Collegial, and Institutional Protocols." Now, I will not repeat what you say, I won't even summarize it entirely, but let me suggest, I hope you won't disagree with that, that you are essentially examining semantic and pragmatic issues which have a close relationship, of course, to my subject of today, but are not identical with it. What Petar Bojanić discusses, as I understand him, are the collective dimensions of any individual or personal action which presents itself, engages itself, in fact, in the service of the public or the community, in as much as this involves the capacity to create or to yes, to realize in practice and anticipate the institutional dimension. What Petar writes at the end of his very last phrase of his sentence of his paper is an institutional act is also an engaged act that calls for the engagement of all for the sake of transforming occasional one-off acts of help, for example, in NGOs or other institutions and organizations, into consistent institutional actions, that is, institutional agency. And therefore, of course, the emphasis is strongly put on the institutional dimension, which will not be directly my case, but in a very interesting modality, which is the modality of anticipation. So what is emphasized here is the aspect of anticipation of such acts which open, which open possibilities. And the important idea is to show that this quality of anticipation towards the institution is best understood, in fact, in English through the combination of the two categories, engagement and commitment, the temporal and the subjective, I would say. And this is important for me, but it is not my main topic, which is more the partisan activity of its partisanship, the partisan activity of intellectuals who, qua intellectuals, decide to defend, to illustrate, to support a political, or more generally a social, perhaps we should say, and also, of course, a moral cause, and therefore find it necessary to join a movement. And I take the term movement or the category movement in the broadest possible sense. But of course, I have several historical references in mind. I can think of the distinction between campaigns and movements, which was proposed by Richard Rorty. But I can think also of the fact that when Marx and Engels, who, as you easily imagine, are among my privileged references and have been so throughout my life when they define what they call a party in the celebrated 1847 manifesto of the Communist Party. In fact, describe not the institution that we today call a political party, including a communist party, whether in France or in China, but precisely a movement. And what I'm interested in is, and here I will immediately introduce another formula that has been associated historically with the vicissitudes, I would say, of Jean-Paul Sartre's engagement, even if they are not members, and in fact, how can you be a member of a movement, but a compagnon de route or fellow travelers of that movement. So the emblematic figure, as you understand, at least at the beginning of my presentation, is precisely Jean-Paul Sartre. This is, I believe, totally inevitable. It will be my starting point. Now here, I cannot not pay attention to the fact that in the very same paper I was referring to, Petar Bojanić, has a footnote where Sartre also features. And I will read your footnote, Petar. Although commitment, in brackets, is now often not translated at all into European languages, Howard S. Becker's text of Margaret Gilbert's commitment are translated as engagement, is that French? Engagement. While in the opposite direction, Sartre's or Adorno's engagement is translated into American English as commitment. See Becker, Gilbert, Ballard. Joint commitment is translated into French as engagement conjoint, Gilbert, and not as, for example, co-engagement, which would be co-engagement, which would be much more straightforward, but not very idiomatic, if you allow me. Now, I find this absolutely remarkable because this shows very clearly that engagement is untranslatable in the sense in which the now relatively well-known dictionary of untranslatables directed and imagined and realized under the direction of Barbara Cassin and translated into English and other languages, has tried to characterize this type of word, traveling among languages, but never, as she explained, ceasing to be translated because no translation is ever completely adequate. But of course, because here, that's a privilege, of course, that's a cultural privilege. We find ourselves in an academic environment where these various idioms are all more or less practiced and used by all of us. We can make use of this little trick, bringing the foreign word or alien word into the language that we are speaking, without, of course, forbidding, I would say, the attempt at finding partial or complex equivalent. Now, the fact that Petar refers here not only to Sartre, so we are reminded of the fact that in standard translations, l'engagement selon Jean-Paul Sartre, one of the absolutely well-known and common topics of contemporary philosophy, is translated as Sartre's notion of commitment or Sartre's personal commitment. But there are increasingly, I found that on the internet, there are increasing places in dissertations and articles, etc., where they return out the French word. But there's an additional twist to this issue arising from the fact that you refer to Adorno's essay. Because Adorno wrote his own essay, fascinating critical discussion of Sartre and attempt at suggesting an alternative view. If I'm not mistaken, in 1965, in German, of course, it's now published in Noten zur Literatur, herausgegeben von Rolf Tiedemann, Frankfurt am Main, so kam dann 1981, but the title is Engagement in French. So Adorno draws our attention to the fact that if you want to discuss Sartre, even to contradict him and to push further into a different place, you're forced, in fact, to use the French word. Now, this French word, which I will continue using in the original context where it was presented, put forward by Sartre, essentially in two extremely famous essays or texts of unequal length. The Présentation du temps moderne, the introductory note opening the series of his journal, one of the most typically engagé journals, intellectual journals of the 20th century, and then the celebrated essay called What is Literature? Qu'est-ce que la littérature? Published in the volume Situation 2 a few years later. So this takes us back to 49 and 1949 and 1950. Arranges, I would say, around the word and the notion of engagement in order to explain a series of other terms. And the first thing that draws very powerfully my attention, takes me in a specific direction, is Sartre's immediate reference to a famous passage in Pascal. Blaise Pascal's Pensée from 1670. Now, this is the celebrated, in a sense, he's just making use of his memories from the school. I mean, of course. This is the celebrated aphorism, as you know, Pensée, aphorism, known as le pari, the theory of le pari or the wager. And in fact, Sartre does refer twice to this pari, this idea of the pari. Once in a completely explicit manner, only the name Pascal is missing, and once in an indirect but easily recognizable form. So here is a Lomi. I hope you don't refuse to hear that. Allow me to read to you one sentence in French from Pascal's text. Oui, mais il faut parier. Cela n'est pas volontaire. And we must bet. It is not voluntary. Vous êtes embarqué. You are always already in the boat, on board. Lequel prendrez-vous donc? Lequel parti? Which side or which choice? Voyons, let us see, puisqu'il faut choisir, voyons ce qui nous intéresse le moins, etc., etc. And then if you move from there to Sartre's, and I have only the French, but I'm sure it's not very difficult to follow, we find the following formulas. It follows the description of the way in which the individual is determined, or as Sartre says, and that, of course, as an old Althusserien strikes me very strongly, over-determined by the very conditions of the situation, social, educational, etc., cultural, in which he has been formed. So, totalement conditionné par sa classe, son salaire, completely conditioned by his, I would say his, In French here, there's no gender. The whole thing is mostly on the masculine. I believe everybody understands the historical reasons for that limitation. So totally conditioned by his class, his salary, the nature of his job, conditioned even in his intimate sentiments, jusque dans ses feelings, jusque dans ses sentiments, jusqu'à ses pensées, even in his thoughts, c'est pourtant lui qui décide du sens de sa condition. Nevertheless, he or she will decide the meaning, what that condition means, et celle de ses camarades. C'est lui qui librement, freely, donne au prolétariat un avenir d'humiliation sans trêve ou de conquête et de victoire. Grants the proletariat either a future of indefinite, interminable humiliation or of conquest and emancipation, in fact, and victory, selon qu'il se choisit, résigné ou révolutionnaire, depending on whether he chooses himself to be, what is a good word in English for résigné?
Resign himself.
Resign. Interesting, because Adorno also wrote an extremely interesting essay called Résignation, the opposite of engagé, ou révolutionnaire, or revolutionary. Et c'est à ce choix qu'il est, et c'est de ce choix qu'il est responsable, non point libre de ne pas choisir, il est, here is Pascal literally, non point libre de ne pas choisir, il est engagé, il faut parier, l'abstention est un choix. Not free not to choose. He's engagé, he must bet or win. Can you say that? Is it verb? Yes. Abstention itself is a choice. Sorry if I was a little long. Now, what's the difference between Sartre and Pascal? I believe it's not the paradoxical or antinomic articulation that we are presented here with of the situation on one side, totally conditioned, and freedom on the other side, or if you prefer, being embarqué and closed on board and choosing, or between the situation and the decision. But it is, I believe this will be my first thesis or interpretation, it is in the way in which the two writers, the two others, the great theologian and mystic, if you like, was also political, of course, writer, and the existentialist at this moment presenting himself as a fellow traveler of the communist revolutionary movement, the different way in which they articulate the choice and its consequences, which depends, in fact, on two types of, or two understanding of transcendence. Remember that for Sartre, of course, transcendence goes along with the verb to transcend, and that is to transgress, in fact, to transgress the limits or the boundaries of the conditions of the situation. Either within the situation, in the case of Sartre, within or without, I would say, outside this life, this world. The Pascalian subject is expecting, and therefore also imagining, but as little as possible in fact, the consequences of his commitment or engagement in the modality of hope, the theological virtue. And of course, hope and faith are not to be separated. Whereas the Sartrean subject, I would suggest, or the way I'm trying to put my foot in the steps of Sartre, is one who, remaining within the situation, is facing, confronting the consequences, and here it's important to add the consequences for himself or herself, but also, and perhaps above all, the consequences for others of his or her decision. I always thought, or increasingly thought, that the question of the consequences for others of one's own choices, and as a consequence also writings, declarations, public statements, theories, etc., are the most important aspect, whereby, of course, the I that is we and we that is I returns to my consideration. Now, this, of course, involves, I would say, a very paradoxical temporality. The situation in which we are embarqués, as Pascal would say, in fact, represents a moment of engagement which precedes the choice, already before the choice. Whereas the vigor, properly speaking, has to be understood as a choice of the consequences, and therefore a retroactive determination of the situation. But it's interesting to ruminate a little bit on that. What, according to Pascal and also to Sartre, is not possible is not to choose, but the difference between, there is a huge difference, of course, between passively choosing by abstention, and I would say choosing to choose. But choosing to choose is largely, this is what I find important here, is largely choosing the unknown, because the consequences are to come. And if we had time, we could also try and associate here some reflections from Derrida, but I leave that aside. Now, it seems to me that this has, are you following me?
Yes.
Yes. Are you following me? Okay. So this has several implications. I hope I'm not too. No. So, first, I'll mention three of them. First, the authentic choice, and of course, that's a risky implication. The authentic choice is the choice of the extreme position. It's a choice of the extreme, it's the radical choice. That is, it's not the choice withdrawing from itself, imagining, particularly in the form of imagining, fancying to be able to control in advance, to limit, so to speak, beforehand, the consequences to something that is calculable or governable. And here also I'm using some Derridian references. And this must be pushed itself to the extreme, that is to the idea that involved in the idea of engagement is the fact that you or one may and perhaps must find oneself at some point in a place that had not been anticipated, that is not the one we had in mind, or perhaps even is the opposite place of what we had dreamt of and tried to imagine. I don't believe that I'll have much time to elaborate on that because I'm already a little too long on that, but in the continuation of my plan, I had paid at some point a reference to a very interesting and remarkable essay from Slavoj Žižek that perhaps many of you know, on Heidegger, that is now published at the end of the volume, Help Me on Lost Causes. And where Žižek defends the idea that what was wrong in here was not to choose the extreme, but to choose the wrong extremes, which is only a relative error to some extent. And in any case, justifies the fact that he didn't want to apologize. Now, we could discuss that next, but I find it, of course, perhaps for personal reasons as well, equally important and perhaps even more important to reflect on the situation of those subjects, intellectuals in particular, who chose the party of revolutionary communism in history and found themselves at some point siding with totalitarian regimes and practices. The second implication is that to choose means to be involved, as I said, in the first person. And of course, there are many modalities for that. But I derive from that the idea that engagement is incompatible, in the sense in which I take it here, with the position of the spectator or the observer, the impartial spectator or observer, which is not to say that I'm against the position of the impartial observer or spectator. I'm just trying to show that here precisely we face a choice. It's one category or one practice or the other. Now, of course, in the real, so to speak, or in practice, the line of demarcation might not be as simple as that. Certainly because we are accustomed to making use of a notion of critique, which in a sense bridges the gap or has one leads on one side towards engagement, critical engagement, if you like, and on the other side to the position of observing or critical observation. And there are, of course, first rank, so to speak, figures in our recent intellectual and political history, whom I would not hesitate, despite some formulas they had, to inscribe or list in the continuation of the Southern engagement. For example, Michel Foucault, who nevertheless rather referred to an idea of critique of Kantian origin, which could involve enthusiasm, but meant that you are somehow outside. And what I'm suggesting here is that you cannot and you do not remain outside. And finally, the third implication that I see is that to choose, and that's very important to me. To choose means to continue choosing. So I combine these two ideas. You choose to choose, and therefore you choose the unknown, the extreme unknown. But on the other hand, there is an implication which is to continue choosing, which again has many different modalities. Now, one of them, of course, which has been brilliantly presented in some of Alain Badiou's recent or not so recent essays, that's an idea that is continuously there in him, is to call this continuation a faithfulness or a fidelity. Let's say that in English. Faithfulness, yes. And his, but of course, he has the etymology once again in mind, because his first example, his main example, is Saint Paul, and all the others, including Pascal and Lenin, etc., are modeled, so to speak, after that initial example. So in the case of Saint Paul, the starting point is the dramatic event of the revelation, which reverses or converts the subject from one engagement to another, or from one abstention, I could say, or routine or tradition to an active engagement. And after that, of course, the important thing is that the trace, the force, the impact of this event is strong enough to make it possible for a subject never to deviate from that starting point. So I, again, for various reasons, would suggest another terminology, which I found very interestingly used in the recent, in a remarkable, but probably not so well known because it's huge. Collective, another collective book written by Oskar Nicht and Alexander Kluge, where the German term is Eigensinn, but this has been translated into English as obstinacy. Obstinacy. I see obstinacy or being obstinate as something very crucially linked to the idea of engagement. How long did I speak already? More than half an hour.
45 minutes.
45? 45? 45?
Just about.
No, not 45.
Some of your colleagues are already
Okay.
sending.
Sorry?
Some of your colleagues are already sending in some proposals. So Nathalie de Praat wanted to ask you, what do you think about translating as involvement, or is that?
That's not bad. That's a fun. The third. Yes, to choose means to be involved in the first person. And I would. And there are interesting passages in Sartre where Sartre speaks of literature as something physical in the end. So which leads, of course, to great phenomenological question and, in fact, metaphysical question, which is the question whether you can be involved or can be engagé intellectually without, in fact, a bodily dimension. Always there. Okay, so I'm afraid I will have only barely touched it up, but I hope that you give me a few more minutes, if possible, to at least sketch some aspects of the two points I had after that. So my next point is about what I had announced as the question of the position of the intellectual in or with respect to a certain movement. And of course, I made use of several terms: partisanship, fellow traveling, conviction. But there are many others that could be. Now, my intention here is to simply recall or remind us of the fact that the definition and above all the practice, I would say the experience of this adopting this position with of support and illustration with respect to a political movement immediately involves antinomies, and in a sense a phenomenology, if you like, or a critical analysis of engagement is nothing other than the unfolding and of these antinomies and the attempt at overcoming them in the provisional manner. So I will mention two of these antinomies. First antinomy is the antinomy of the two positions, or the antithesis of the two positions: engagement as engagement of the outsider versus engagement of the insider. And of course, here we once again stumble, so to speak, on the fact that the category has been mainly used, especially in Sartre's Présentation des temps modernes, to address intellectuals who himself calls bourgeois intellectuals who are so to be presented with the choice of joining or not joining a revolutionary movement of workers, proletarians. Here, of course, a category that is more recent is an attractive category, but the very name is, in a sense, the embodiment of the difficulty. This is the category of the subaltern, because we remember Spivak's formula, which is very often, I believe, misunderstood. It is the subaltern cannot speak, and if the subaltern cannot speak, then the intellectuals are only too happy to step in order to speak on her behalf, because in Spivak is essentially feminine, and to speak on her behalf is, of course, to mute her. And from there, we could unfold the series of well-known consequences, precisely, which are also perversions of the engagement. And the question is whether this is inevitable. I see at least 2 or 3 of them which are typical. Victimization. The engagé intellectual is one who describes at length the situation of the victims of exploitation and domination, speaking on their behalf, but also, and that's perhaps even more perverse, idealization, and especially idealization in the form of universalization. And here, why not say some of the most admirable and remarkable texts written by Marx in the period of his youth are perhaps indicative of a problem. In any case, they are very typical. The proletariat is the universal class. Who says that the proletariat is the universal class? It's precisely the intellectual. Or better said, if you have the Hegelian references in mind, is the intellectual who implicitly or explicitly says something. Look, the universal class is not us, intellectuals, professors, philosophers. It's you or them, the proletarians, which of course catches immediately, not to say imprisons the movement itself in the categories of the intellectual. And I would gladly also add, but I know that this is a sensitive issue, another form of perversion, which is radicalization. But here I miss a good English word equivalent of surenchère, the overbid. Intellectuals are only too prone when they are engagés, and precisely because they want and they need to go to the extreme to overbid.
Up the ante. They always want to up the ante.
Up the ante. Like when you're betting.
Yes. Up the ante. Okay, so now what's allow me to return for a minute to Marx, because Marx's a solution as expressed particularly in the Communist Manifesto. Some beautiful passages of the Communist Manifesto is extremely interesting. His solution, slightly different from whatever I have mentioned until now, involves bringing in the remarkable figure of the traitor. The figure that the engagé intellectual above all has to embody and adopt is the figure of the traitor. Marx writes in the Communist Manifesto, at some point when the conditions of the situation are approaching the final battle, or the moment when the antagonism can no longer become erased and mitigated, some bourgeois intellectuals leave their camp, the one in which they have been educated, formed, and to which they are, in a sense, institutionally committed, and they move to the other side, which is linked in this representation also to a certain idea of the realization of philosophy. Now, I find this very interesting because the problematic, I would say, of treason and treachery is something different. Treason is a problematic that inevitably haunts any phenomenology of the phenomenon of engagement, and that is that can shift to the other side of the antinomy that I was presenting. Because as we know, and I will give a name in a minute of a great my opinion, great philosopher of this period, who's insisted on that. As soon as the movement becomes organized, as the movement becomes a party, not in the old sense, but in the modern sense, the movement needs, in quasi, semi-Gramscian terminology, its own organic intellectual. This is a narrow sense of the notion of organic intellectual. That is, it needs leaders, but it needs also educated activists, or educated activists who educate the others within the movement itself. And this can easily become lived, experienced, painfully, I would say. It's really a form of unhappy consciousness, or denunciated and stigmatized as a treason from inside. And in a sense, this is the name that I wanted to mention. Nobody has explained this better than Jacques Rancière, of course. As soon as the movement creates teachers, leaders, professors, theorists from inside, whatever their social origin, this is not the important point. In a sense, they are moving to the other side. They are silencing their own comrades and fellow proletarians in the very attempt at developing the group. The second antinomy, and I will have to accelerate, and the second antinomy that is closely, of course, linked to the first, is the antinomy of science and of scientific engagement and revolutionary engagement. So what I take here to have been the case in the history, in particular, of the revolutionary movements which presented themselves under the aegis or the name of communism is really a double bind. Meaning it proved both impossible to fuse science and revolution, even if attempts were made at that, so that following this idea of the realization of philosophy, the two attitudes, the quest for knowledge or the quest for truth, and the quest for subversion, transformation, and changing the world for them to become indiscernible. But of course, on the other hand, it proved also impossible, or only I tend to believe, but I'm ready to hear criticism or critiques of that, from a completely utopian manner, to have them disjoined, separated. And in particular, I take it to be very revelatory and interesting that this tradition struggled continuously with the distinction between theory and practice. It never wanted to accept, I would say, the purely analytical, positivist, bourgeois, I would say, in the Lukácsian spirit of theory and practice as separated realms. Now, we don't have time to evoke the many modalities of that double mind, but again, I find it interesting to meditate on Marx's personal example. Not so much perhaps what Marx said, what Marx wrote. Marx wrote at length on the dialectical overcoming of the antinomy, of the antithesis of science and revolution and theory and practice. But what I find more interesting is what I take to have been his personal attitude, or if you prefer, his personal engagement. And here I have no objection against translating as commitment, because this appears clearly as a double or twin commitment. Commitment to knowledge, science, or equal science and truth on one side, and commitment to partisanship on the and revolutionary programs on the other side. I wrote something like that at the end of my commitment, to quote myself, my little book on Marx, the philosophy of Marx. That Marx, I used the quasi-Lacanian formula, and again I have problems of translation. Lacan's formula is ne pas céder sur son désir, not to give up.
Yes, give it.
Not to
Or give in.
give in.
Give in or give up.
Give up. Neither to give up nor to give in on what is your desire. But the fact is that Marx had two desires completely, and he found himself in several times in the situation of having, in a sense, to choose and not being able to choose, at least in a completely unilateral form. So he didn't give in or give up on his desire for knowledge, which even once in a very interesting text of his critical notes on the Goethe program ends with this ironic religious or quasi-religious formula in Latin, Dixi et salva vi anima mea, I said, and I saved my mind. But on the other hand, of course, he was never looking for science as pure science. So the question we might ask, and I'll finish with that, is what is the price? What is the price to be paid for the impossibility to entirely overcome this antinomy? In Marx himself, the price seen from inside, and at the theoretical level, which is the one that interests me most in this moment, is in fact the emporia of the political. The political ought to be in principle the place or the point of convergence where the desire of knowledge and the desire of revolution dovetail or merge. But as we know, or at least I submit that, or several of us know, Marx doesn't have a concept of the political. His concept of the political is oscillating permanently between statism, the use of the state to transform the existing relations of production, and anarchism. He even writes, I am the true anarchist. That is, of course, the self-organization of what is now very often called the commons, or the assembly, And I find it very interesting, of course, that those Marxists who did, in fact, perhaps not in an absolutely undeniable and final manner, move beyond this Marxian incapacity or impossibility to define the political, were also, of course, those who tried to elaborate the notion of the intrinsic politicality of the intellectual activity as such. And I have two names in mind, and I'll finish with that very provisionally. One, of course, is Gramsci. And here I must rectify what I said of the notion of the organic intellectual, because the most interesting formula, meaning of the organic intellectual in Gramsci is not simply the activist, the leader, the organizer within an institution. The organic intellectual is organic not to a party or an institution, but is organic to a class. Here, of course, the most interesting aspect, as many of us know, is that Gramsci also moves beyond the category of consciousness or class consciousness that had been prevalent in the whole socialist and communist tradition. The intellectual is not the one who embodies consciousness or brings consciousness or helps bringing in consciousness into the movement. Is the one who produces changes within the dominant culture, and therefore, of course, makes it possible or contributes to the capacity of subalterns, as he calls that himself, of course, to create or elaborate an antithetic culture from within the contradictions of the dominant culture. And the second example, of course, is Althusser, my master Althusser. I can never leave him. I don't know why. And so, what's interesting in Althusser, I believe, is something which is not totally separated from this well-known theory of ideological state apparatuses, but it's not totally coherent with that. I believe that Althusser stumbled on something which was a perfect example of the antinomic character of the idea of engagement in that sense, when he at some point explained that the Communist Party is a party that exists outside the realm of the state, and therefore the realms of the institutional forms of politics in today's world, which is a completely idealistic and utopian formula, even if it's beautiful. That was his dream. But in other formulas of the same period, and we will be back to Pascal, Althusser proposed the idea that psychoanalysis and historical materialism, but why not specifically history? Or history in as much as it is never separated from politics, and the combination of the intertwining of both is a very typical illustration of the problem that engagement leads us to. So he invented the idea, or he proposed the idea that these disciplines are, he uses again the category science, are schismatic sciences. In fact, he says scissionist, science scissionist. But the German translator, and the text was published, the text on Freud and Marx was published in German before being published in French. And it was shown, of course, to Althusser, and the extraordinary idea of proposing schismatic sites. Now, this, of course, makes us think of a religious environment rather than a political or philosophical one, especially a materialist one. But as we know, Althusser also, just like Sartre and so many other French philosophers, was an avid reader of Pascal. And therefore, the place we have to look for in order to explain what this can mean is are the places, writings on grace, écrits sur la grâce, where in fact Pascal explained that in matters of religion, let's translate in matters of engagement or Paris, there's never an orthodoxy that can be formulated as such. What exists are only heresies, antithetic heresies, or deviations, or errors, which of course contradict each other. Therefore, in this realm, but that is the same for communism or any other great cause that we can imagine, the only possibility and the task that is the primordial task of the intellectual, who again is not necessarily just a bourgeois intellectual, but can have very different origin, is to anticipate, to try to anticipate the rectification of what is perceived now as a truth, the right, the just line, and will inevitably at some point appear as an error, or at least, let's be a little more cautious, marked, including errors. This has to be linked to the fact, again, that there is no engagement without involvement, as he suggests to say. Because it's only if you are inside the movement that you can exercise that critical or negative attitude. And here, of course, and I finish with that, excuse me to have so confused and long, two formulas come to my mind. The one is the one that a moment ago I was stunned by that Philip Golub quoted to me, but with a different application. This is the Mephistophelic formula. Ich bin der Geist, der stets verneint. I am the spirit who continuously negates. So the wise practice of negation is appears to us as a fundamental aspect of engagement. The other one is a Machiavellian formula. This is not incompatible. This is a Machiavellian formula that Althusser frequently referred to, and as often in his case, when I tried to locate the formula exactly where it was supposed to be, I didn't find it immediately, but I don't say he lied. This is a formula, I looked for it in L'Art de la Guerre, the art of war. And it's the formula is the following. You shouldn't carry or pull guns, cannon, within a troop, marching, because, and of course you have to remember how the guns were pulled by horses. And even today, I believe in military parades, it's a little bit like that, the tanks are. And of course the gun is directed not towards the front, but towards the rear. So the formula would be, or should be, you shouldn't have guns in a marching troop because the gun shoots in the opposite direction of where you go. An extraordinary allegory. And I believe that what we could cautiously bring in at this point, with the obvious enormous risks that it contains, is the idea that the position of the intellectual within the movement is to shoot in the opposite direction of where it moves. But how to support a movement while shooting against its representation of its own movement, that was never an easy task. Therefore, engagement through engagement, sorry for breaking my promise to speak French, engagement, in as much as it involves to choose the consequences of your choice, brings to a certain, I wouldn't say a point of impossibility, but a paradoxical point at the very least. Sorry for the horrible confusion of all that.
Thank you.
I have to go there. Huh? To be seen. The ABC. No, it's not necessary to be seen.
No,
please,
please. Nobody will hear you.
Yeah, this matter.
Where do you want to
I don't know how. No. Just like this. No, just one question. Etienne, thank you very much. Thank you for never mind. Thank you for your kindness to be here with us. Last night you sent me one phrase, radical engagement.
Yes.
I'd like to remind you, maybe you remember this text. Lukács wrote one text in 1932, it translated immediately, 34 in English. The name of the text is Tendenz oder Parteilichkeit.
Tendenz oder Parteilichkeit. I believe that Adorno refers to that text in his own essay, which I reread, but I haven't.
Because Tendenz maybe could be, as Natalie said, for involvement, yes. Tendenz could be also one kind of synonymous of engagement. In that text, Lukács, before Sartre, is trying to suggest replacing Tendenz with partisan. Because Tendenz, used by Engels, used by Behring, used by Heine, is bourgeois for him. Would such an engagement be current or sufficiently radical or even be possible today? Yes.
Repeat that.
Would such an engagement?
Would that?
Yeah. Please, radical.
Thank you so much. I don't know if the invisible audience is still following us or me, those meanders. I'm struggling with something of my own history, which haven't reached the conclusion, facing the consequences. So let me, for a minute, return to this word, radical engagement. I used it and I introduced it in the summary that I sent you. As you probably noticed, what I said today represents about 1/3 of what I had announced to you. That will come some other day. But perhaps it's the essential. So because I was trying once again with my poor English to find a good equivalent for the idea of aller aux extrêmes or choisir les extrêmes. Which of course reminds us of the essay by Sawyer I was referring to a minute ago. Now, representation of European history and perhaps world history, but seen from a European angle. There have been two great extremes in political extremes. in the history of the 20th century, which both have this remarkable characteristics that they attracted and they involved in the other sense intellectuals of the first magnitude, I would say, and perhaps the greatest intellectuals of this period. So, and the fact that you mentioned Lukács is, of course, especially interesting for me, because whenever we once again start the discussion about Schmidt and Heidegger and a few others, and they are the main, most interesting, of course, how come these great minds could become Nazis? My tendency, my reaction is to immediately bring in also the symmetric case of somebody like Lukács. And in Adorno's piece that we were referring to at the beginning, a good half of it is a severe critique of Brecht, a very harsh critique of Brecht, which is interesting but also disputable, because it explains that Brecht sacrificed, not only sacrificed his art to his politics, but in fact made his lyrical and dramatic genius the pure instrument, I simplify perhaps a little, of his political blindness. And so all these cases are, I believe, more or less on the par. Now, the idea of the extremes, is an interesting idea, because we have, because it's a topographic idea. It's a topographic idea. So therefore, it involves a representation of the topography of the intellectual scene and the way it becomes intertwined with the political scene. So, of course, my assumption here is that you do not, but I don't ask everybody to agree with that, you do not really face the confront the importance and the consequences and the risks of articulating intellectual work or intellectual activity with politics if you believe to avoid the difficulties and the risk by choosing the middle way or the middle path, the juste milieu, as I would say in French, which of course has many remarkable possible formulations. One of the most interesting for me is Max Weber's double neutralization of the value antagonism in the intellectual field and in the political field, a desperate attempt at using the violence that is inherent in the political while not becoming its slave or its prisoner. So this is a grand formulation, which in a sense, I'm tempted to say, also tries to reach a certain extremity or involves, if you agree with that translation, a certain radicality. Perhaps the core, the essence of that radicality is the recognition, is the acknowledgement of the depth of the contradiction itself. And then, of course, something else would come, which would be, and back to sorry, long and confused once again, would be the question whether the extremes are really symmetric. which is not what I believe, in fact. So, but if I throw this on the table, you say, of course, you want look actions of Brecht's compromising with Stalinism to be in some sense, less catastrophic and more forgivable in a sense than Schmitt's and Heidegger's compromission with Nazism, compromising with Nazism. So here I would have to try and argue again on more or less Althusserian line that at least in the principle, the Marxian discourse involves a capacity that it did not always make use of, far from, to criticize its own errors or even its own crimes, that Nazi ideology never had and would never have. So of course Heidegger is interesting here. Forget about Schmitt. Heidegger is interesting here because, and that's what Zizek explained, because he moves, of course, beyond the realm of the political. But that is not criticizing. That is not a form of self-criticism. And on the other hand, of course, I would have to admit that in practice, the Marxists didn't really exercise this capacity, or only very limited manner, or without consequences that would change the course of their own movement. So, in a sense, the Marxists would never become Marxists in that sense. Now, returning to your attendance oder Parteilichkeit, I would have to reread the text. But what I hear, tell me if I'm wrong, is that he said that tendency is a bourgeois concept. So tendency is a bourgeois concept if tendency is closely linked to the idea of progress and the determinist representation of the course of history. So, therefore, it is linked to something that is crucial, of course, in the Marxist tradition and more generally the socialist tradition in our world, which is the idea that the great confrontation is between stability or order and movement or transformation. That was the 19th century terminology that, in a sense, Marx adopted and reformulated in his own category. There was the party of order. The party of order is the one that sticks, of course, to the vested interests of the bourgeoisie and the capital. Therefore, their aim is to keep things as they are, or indefinitely reproduce them. Whereas the objective of the socialist and the revolutionary is to explode or break up this existing order and liberate or emancipate the forces of progress, which can also be called the productive forces. The productive forces are the proletariat and the technology or the science. So this is the determinist representation in which unquestionably, undoubtedly, Marx was himself caught, with the exception of few interesting insights. It soon leads to the idea that the revolutionary task is to accelerate the course of history in the direction of its own tendency, which is always already tendency to overcome the existing state of it. Communism is the real movement that overcomes or transforms the existing state of things. And it also leads to that crazy idea in the very center of Marx's preface to the 1859 contribution of to the critique of political economy. Humankind, die Menschheit, humankind never assigns itself problems or tasks that it could not resolve. Aufgaben, die sie nicht lösen kann. Why? Because if you look closer, right, you will see that the material conditions for the resolution of the problem are already there, latent or immanent in the current situation. Nothing is, of course, more wrong from this is what all our experience, political experience teaches us. So if Parteilichkeit, partisanship has to be sharply distinguished from the idea of tendency, it inevitably, I believe, takes us back to the idea that a choice is not simply the realization of a political choice, is not simply the realization of the existing tendency or the tendency. I'm not sure if that is what he says, but that is already given. And therefore, the choice is always one choice against another. Or again, within the movement itself, it's permanently choosing one party or one possibility against another. For example, Russian Revolution, Lenin chooses one possibility. And the consequences show that this is not as simple as one said and for all. But it also could be, in my opinion, associated with the speculating, with the idea that contrary to the banal and common idea of the stability of the dominant order, but in complete agreement and coherence with the other Marxian idea, namely the idea that capitalism continuously revolutionizes, can you say revolutionizes its own institutions, which is very much what we see today. Capitalism is not a stable order. Acceleration is not something that we impose on capitalism. It's something that capitalism wages itself permanently. And therefore, and here I believe that the thesis on Feuerbach have a little hinted that direction, but the one who best, in my view, formulated that, perhaps it is a contemporary of Lukács, and that is Ernst Bloch. In his commentary of the thesis, where he says there would be no change. There would be no change if there was not eine Veränderbarkeit, changeability. But you can put that to the idea the change is already there. The change is already there. The question is, how do you change the change? And here, of course, a bifurcation is always present, or a choice. And therefore, you can choose one extreme or the other extreme. And that is the essence of Parteilichkeit, or partisanship.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And now, as you refer to them, the invisible audience is eager to ask some questions,
Yes.
some comments. So we will start from Andrea Perunovic, a research fellow.
Andrea
Perunovic. He is a research fellow at the Institute for
how do
Philosophy
you
and
spell his
Social
name?
Theory. Perunovic.
Andrea Perunovic, yes.
Bonjour, Monsieur Balibar. J'espère que vous m'entendez de cette manière un peu spectrale. Là.
Très, très bien. Very loud.
Okay, thank you. So we hear you. Thank you before for your lecture. And my question would be, I was expecting you to mention one author that you cherish and we have been working on for so many years, which is Spinoza.
Ah, yes.
Is there for you, in your view, some kind of a Spinozist engagement? some kind of engagement of the excommunicated, of the expelled?
Yes. Oui. You don't catch me by surprise.
Sorry.
No, you don't catch me entirely by surprise, but still, with this reference to the excommunication, of course, you add a twist or a combination that I had not totally expected, and I thank you for that. Because what I would have said spontaneously, and believe it or not, I had a second thought on that will be for another time, was to associate the name of Spinoza, to not only the possibility, but the very effective, I would say, situation or case of theoretical engagement. So that is moving apparently to the other extreme, or choosing among the two desires of Marx, the case or the side of the desire for knowledge or true knowledge, suggests that the theoretical engagement is no less passionate, no less radical in the sense that we have just mentioned, and therefore, in the end, no less risky or dangerous than the kind of engagement that we have been discussing or alluding to until now. Of course, there are interesting cases to be discussed as well, because that would also lead us to bring in the possibility of an engagement that is anti-intellectual or anti-intellectualist. What I have in mind, for example, is Simone Weil or Rogalina going to the factory, moving to the factory, and in a sense sacrificing, or apparently sacrificing, the intellectual dimension. But in fact, this is never entirely true, not even in these, especially not in these two cases. On the side of Spinoza, we apparently have something which could be described as absolute passion for truth, and this is why I'm not so happy, in fact, with the last fashion, I would say, in the understanding of Spinoza, which tries desperately to explain that Spinoza is not, that there is no intellectualism in Spinoza's philosophy. How can you reconcile that with the third kind of knowledge and the idea of the intellectual love of God? So there's an element of radicality and absoluteness in that case. But then, when you have said that, and I could also admit that, of course, there are also perversions on that side. So the philosopher, the Western philosopher, the Althusserian philosopher, etc., is only too fascinated by the Spinozistic ideal, which views everything, or seems to try to view everything from the point of view of so-called eternity or necessity. But then, of course, you go a little more deeper into the analysis of the situation, and you realize I believe two things. Here, of course, the excommunication is a good guide. First, Spinoza is absolutely opposed to any ontological dualism. So if he's an intellectualist and a radical intellectualist, if his motto is sed intelligere, but we must understand, we must try and understand the body and everything that the body connotes, and the materialities that can be associated with the body are not to be left aside, they're not to be dropped, they are to be involved, precisely, or introduced into that very intellectual life, which suggests many things, mystical, and so on. And second, you have to admit that Spinoza also had a passion for politics, but I would be tempted to say had a passion for the understanding of politics, so that is the matter to which this intellectualism has to be applied, in fact, is the political matter, or the ethical, the political matter. And therefore, of course, inevitably, you're also led to asking the question, which kind of effects, which kind of consequences do you produce in the realm of politics if you are entirely caught and committed, committed to the idea that there is something to be understood in the political practice itself. That is not, it is not purely empirical, that there is a sort of necessity there, if only the necessity of the political passions themselves. So in the end, of course, you arrive at something that is perhaps not so completely different from, very different from Sartre, and not so completely different from Marx, except it's the detour you have been making means that you problematically reach the political consequences at the end, and they are not given at the beginning.
Thank you.
Other question?
Yes, the next question comes from Julien Palotta.
Julien Palotta, who speaks.
Bonjour Étienne.
Bonjour Julien. Bonjour.
Ça va?
Julien is in Rio de Janeiro.
Ouais, c'est l'heure du repas, j'ai pas encore mangé. Bon. Étienne, well, I'd like to, I was thinking something listening to you. Well, from the beginning of your speech, I was thinking about Althusser.
Yeah, Julia, can you lower your microphone a little bit? This is terribly
No?
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Is it okay like that?
It's okay.
Okay. Yes, I was thinking about Althusser from the beginning of your speech. And I was wondering if, in a way, the Althusserian theory of ideological interpellation could be interpreted as a response to the Sartrean theory of engagement.
Not bad.
And I'd like just to read to you an extract from Althusser that you could comment about interpellation. L'interpellation de l'individu en sujet qui fait de lui un sujet idéologique ne se réalise pas à partir d'une idéologie unique, mais de plusieurs idéologies à la fois, sous lesquelles le sujet vit et agit sa pratique. Idéologie soit très locale, tel un sujet dans sa famille et dans son travail, dans ses rapports immédiats avec ses proches ou semblables, idéologie plus large, locale au sens large, ou régionale ou nationale, en grande partie à l'origine toujours héritée du passé, la tradition. Il en résulte un jeu et un espace de multiplicité d'interpellations dans lequel le sujet est pris, mais qui, comme jeu contradictoire et espace, constitue la liberté entre guillemets, du sujet individuel, interpellé par plusieurs idéologies à la fois, qui ne sont pas de même nature ni de même niveau, et qui expliquent l'évolution libre entre guillemets, des prises de position de l'individu sujet. L'individu dispose ainsi d'un jeu de manœuvre. My suggestion was that this passage could be read as a Spinozist Freudian theory of engagement, and Sartre would be more Cartesian, a Cartesian voluntarist. What do you think about that? Thanks.
But we have to make this very long story short. First of all, I'm sure you realize while you reread this text, and I hope that those among our auditors who understand French also perceive that, and I apologize to the others. Of course, that there's something extremely ironic in the use of the category liberté, liberty in the text, which the brackets, of course, make perceive pain. So this of course would reinforce your suggestion that the Sartrean notion of engagement is one of the interlocutors or is there in the background of these formulas, and in fact is a target of Althusser's criticism, because the most immediate understanding of that is what Sartre seems to believe is that in every situation there does exist a possibility of absolute choice, which cannot be explained if not ontologically, because the human as such is free. Whereas what I see myself is an extremely limited and relative possibility of choice, which is only the choice among, it's not nothing, the choice among different ways of being subjected to the ideological relations. Now this leads, I believe, to the other aspect of the question, which is interesting and which, since you refer to Freud, I would gladly associate with a reading or a reference to certain passages in Freud, especially his theory of identification and mass formations. Incidentally, of course, Althusser had reread that. We have his notes, reading notes when he was writing his piece on ideological state apparatuses, but he doesn't quote Freud. So again, there seems to be something extremely pessimistic or nihilistic, almost nihilistic in this description. Just as Freud seems to indicate that we only have the possibilities in our lives to shift from one ego ideal to another, but never to liberate ourselves completely from our dependency or our identification with such models. Althusser seems to indicate that we only have the possibility to shift from one interpellation to another. Now, this is not uninteresting because, of course, the next question would be, does it lead to the same practical consequences to be interpellated or to let oneself be interpellated by, say, the state, the French laïcité, the jihad, or the communist revolution, or the mother nature, the cause of the environment, and so on. So the answer would probably be, formally there is no difference, but practically there can be worlds apart, which leads to the suggestion that there is not only ideology at stake in this situation, but Althusser, as a good Marxist, would probably suggest that the determining force of the that makes a difference is not a choice, it's a movement, precisely. It's the fact that you join the good movement or the bad one. So I see this as a very interesting question, but I'm not sure we can escape the circle. And I don't know if I mentioned that moment earlier, but yes, I believe I said this was Althusser's utopian moment when he says the Communist Party is a Communist Party that is outside the state, which in his terminology would mean the Communist Party is not part of the ideological state apparatuses. But I have to admit, and I said it in several places, that I never understood where the Communist Party could be, if not among the ideological state apparatuses. So back to your question.
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, but I didn't understand your name. But that's all your nickname. Or your
Thomas here. I'm joining from Geneva. Thank you very much for your presentation. My question is actually a distinction that resonated with your presentation was the one made by Nancy in La Communauté des œuvrés between the notion of œuvre and that of the task, right? That despite the absence of œuvre or the negation of œuvre, one could still take on or take up or give oneself tasks. And in your, I was wondering if in your suggestion that the engagement is in a sense this task of anticipation was rather following the modalities of the task rather than that of the œuvre, and what you thought of this.
Because to my surprise, relative embarrassment, but certainly you are not surprised yourself. I find myself continuously returning to Althusser in this presentation. I cannot not also associate with the question you asked for a famous formula in Althusser's preface to his Four Marks, in which he describes in a sense, the miserable, I would say, the miserable condition of, this is of course his theoreticist moment, miserable condition of communist intellectuals and more generally intellectual engagés who are now, well, it's supposed that they are so deeply involved in militant, say, actions and activities, and implicitly also that they are so brutally subjected to the dictatorship of the political line that, qua philosophers, they produce no work, pas d'œuvre. Ces philosophes sans œuvre, which also, of course, resonated with Foucault's definition of folie as absence d'œuvre. So if you push that a little bit further, you get the idea that these philosophers are bound to end in madness because their practice and their understanding of engagement prevents them from producing an ordinary philosophical sense of the term. And all this, of course, has roots where Nancy wants to return, that is in Blanchot's notion of désœuvre and désœuvrement. So I would not say that the intellectual engagé is one who produces no work. Is a notion that is floating between different contexts. I'd first suggest the opposite. What is the engagement engagement of the intellectual worth if he or she doesn't produce an Now, and this might also, and I'm even tempted to say an œuvre which is also an œuvre d'art, because I believe that this artistic or literary, etc. dimension is impossible to separate from the idea that you produce writings and speeches. The two modalities, of course, are not totally equivalent, but never entirely separated, which are not for themselves, for you, but they are for the public real. They are, and so the dimension of œuvre cannot be simply and I would say abstractly negated. Now, when Nancy refers to the distinction between the œuvre and the tâche, I'd have to return to the text. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that he has in mind a critique of the representation of œuvre as a totality, as a totality. So therefore, one way or another, he's following an idea of deconstruction. So the only œuvre that is worth taking into account from a point of view of engagement is a kind of self-deconstructive work. Now you could hear that from a moralistic point of view, which is not what I find most interesting. There would be, in fact, a kind of incompatibility between engagement and artistic narcissism or professional narcissism. I find it more interesting to reflect on the modalities in which œuvre engagée, that is theoretical and therefore also artistic works, can never become achieved, completed. All the important intellectual works which we can associate with this concept of engagement are unfinished. And they are unfinished because their writers realize before putting the end, the closing the scene and the stage, that there is something somewhere which doesn't work, in the other sense of working. So the explanations, so this is my personal myth, the explanations of the type Spinoza did not finish the theory of the political treatise because he was very ill, and unfortunately his forces left him before he had written the chapter on democracy, which is of course Icrodus Ixalta, the place where the whole issue at stake will have to eventually become resolved. Marx could not finish writing Capital because he was himself, also he had bad health, and his innumerable political responsibilities and tasks devoured his time. So that was already the case before. And he had considered that nothing was more important than writing the first volume of Capital. Sartre could never write and finish the second volume of the Critique of Dialectical Reason. Être néant is an oeuvre. That's, of course, at the end it answers the question. This is, that's, I don't say that against it, but it's not engagé. I mean, it's not engagé. The Critique of Dialectical Reason is unfinished. And so on and so on. So perhaps we should not make this sacralize this form, but it's very revealing. It says something about the untimeliness of the articulation between engagement and theory. So, should we call that a task? What bothers me, I'd have to return to the task. We could say the task is to start again before you are done. That's true for communism, of course, as such. And here perhaps we have the dissymmetry I was looking for. The task of communism was and should have remained throughout its history to start again. Whereas the task of Nazism, of course, was not to start again. But then task, of course, has some Kantian connotations, which I find not bad, but insufficient. But that's probably not what Nancy has in mind. I'd have to return to the text. It doesn't simply mean there is an ideal, and we'll never, we don't believe that we will reach that ideal. It has to remain before us. Derrida's notion of the two come is not always easy to use, because of course he insists on the fact that this is not the future. So it's not, it's really insisting on the fact that at every moment within democracy, for example, or within any other engagement, the important thing is not there in the present, but is missing. To come means missing, and that's not sharp enough, I would say, from my point.
Thank you. I think Nathalie Delpaz has another.
Nathalie, I'm delighted and honored that you are here.
Please unmute.
Yes. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I will speak in English. It's easier, I think, for everybody. So I had a question. Thank you very much first for your talk. It's very stimulating and motivating for what we are living today. I mean, so thank you very much. I had a question about, because you referred a lot to Sartre, and I was wondering how you would distinguish or not the way Simone de Beauvoir, her conception of engagement, and in relation with Sartre's conception of engagement. Would you make a difference, or how would you? What would be your reflections about that?
You're testing me.
I don't know. It's a genuine question. I mean, really, for me.
Believe it or not, I've just been teaching or trying to teach Simone de Beauvoir. Because at India, where I teach a class in the fall in the French department of contemporary French philosophy, my subject this year was the question of the other with big O and small O, as well in French, 20th century French philosophy. So I began with Sartre, and continued with several others, and of course at some point Fanon arrived, and also Simone de Beauvoir, And then after that, I contrasted Lucie Ringaray with Simone de Beauvoir, which produced very interesting reactions among the students. So I had to, yes, I have to. My acquaintance, my knowledge with the work of Simone de Beauvoir is it does exist, but it's not exhaustive. So I cannot immediately think, and if you have a reference, please give it to us. I cannot immediately think of a place, a text in which Simone de Beauvoir would define her own engagement, whereas there is absolutely no doubt that what she does is an extraordinary illustration, demonstration, that we say, of what it means to combine a moral and political interest and an intellectual passion in the form of engagement. I don't see what I see paradoxically are denegations or what's the term, disowning, so denials, denegations, denials. I am not a feminist. I'm not a feminist. The task of feminism is now, fortunately, she writes at the beginning of the deuxième sexe, behind us, which apparently doesn't mean that all the that the situation has changed and that the relations of domination are now over, but that the feminist discourse as a way to address this situation is no longer decisive. So of course the question becomes immediately, what kind of feminism does she have in mind, and is this her last word? And the answer is no, of course, as we all know. The situation progressively changed before and after 68, and even in a very drastic and radical manner. But even in that later period, again, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't see a definition of that kind. Now, what would, on the other hand, I tend to believe, that, well, first of all, it's well known that Simone de Beauvoir doesn't purely apply or set in met en œuvre, implement, something like that, a Sartrean notion either of engagement and above all, of course, of alienations. I also said to my students, I find it remarkable that it is perhaps in his reflections on the Jewish question that Sartre has proposed, not in Miclo, but in proposed the most direct political transposition of what he had been described in Lettres de Néant as the alienating effect of the other's gaze, something that we. But then, of course, the reflections on the Jewish question is a very disturbing text, because, well, for reasons that are well known, because Sartre doesn't seem to open for the Jewish subject any other possibilities than either mimicking the anti-Semitic stereotypes or adopting some sort of stoic capacity to distance it, etc., etc. So then it's largely supposed that Simone de Beauvoir in her field, or Fanon in his own field, borrowed models from there, but I don't believe that. I don't think that they borrow a model. I think that they profoundly transform the Sartrean concept of alienation, which is not a critique of Sartre, but so that is, and yes, and I hope I'm not losing you in the middle, but you can say, and if you take these two elements together, I mean, the fact that she's inventing a form of literary or theoretical engagement that, in a sense, goes beyond Sartre or overcomes his limitations. And on the other hand, she, during that initial period, at least refuses to be labeled as a feminist. Maybe this is because she doesn't see the cause of the emancipation of the feminine subject as a kind of partisanship, in the sense that we were discussing before. She doesn't want a feminist party. She doesn't want a feminist party. And there have been feminist parties, right? But she's not alone on that side. A dear friend of mine, Françoise Duroux, who died a few years ago after a brain stroke, cancer, etc., whose work on the question of gender difference and feminism is now published by the University of Paris. Can you hear me, Nathalie? No.
Yes, she can.
Yes, she can.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. Yes.
The University of Paris had a counter example, which was Virginia Woolf. I tend I would, if I may say something myself, I would see a point of convergence here. Neither the deuxième sexe nor nor Virginia Woolf's Three Dinies or other texts are manifestos for the construction of a feminist party.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think feminism is a very, in a sense, a dangerous word because it creates a category against another one. So so I think it might be dangerous in a sense as well. But I just maybe to to follow up a bit, I was wondering if you would agree if we say that Simone de Beauvoir is really embedded, embarqué in the Pascalian sense in the social situation, more than Sartre, that maybe would be more of a political view of engagement, where I was wondering.
Yes, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. The présentation des temps modernes and even Question de littérature strike us today, of course, both as, I'd say, fundamental breakthroughs in the history of 20th century thinking. I mean, it's the word that Sartre invents or reformulates with the help of Pascal, etc. Also, of course, remarkably describes his own practice, or in this case, it's consistent. Then, of course, with hindsight, there are, especially rereading the Présentation des temps modernes, is at some moments is a very painful experience, both because of his simplistic aesthetic judgments, which is in a sense some of Adorno's critique. There are terrible things there. La recherche du temps perdu de Proust is an abominable example of art pour l'art, the absolute opposite of engagement, because Proust is himself an inverti, that's the terminology of the period, or a pederast, he also uses that category, doesn't understand himself, doesn't understand that he cannot take his own homosexual example as a starting point to think and create around the issue of love in general. But conversely, of course, some of Sartre's judgments seem to be very much depending on his own social or even moral limitations. Whereas when you move to Simone de Beauvoir's work, which is later, the situation is much more complex and interesting. She doesn't feel it necessary, of course, some feminists today have problems about that, but she doesn't feel it necessary to demonstrate and proclaim. She's not a traitor. She's not into that she's moving from one camp in the direction of the other, because although she refuses to be labeled a woman in the sense in which this the myth of the woman has been constructed by men, and she quotes all the writers, and they're all catastrophic, except Stendhal. So she nevertheless, of course, belongs entirely through her history to the situation that she's describing and criticizing. So she's not a case of an intellectual joining the camp that she wants to support, but she's almost a case of somebody who, from the inside of that camp, creates her own intellectual capacity and discourse with the help, of course, of more philosophical tradition. But then, of course, so that reason stop me when I abuse of your patience. The reason why the celebrated phrase subjected to so many contradictory interpretations, on ne naît pas femme, on le devient. And believe it or not, one of my American students this year has put me in trouble because she's asked me, why does she write on le devient? She should write on la devient. And then I started to speculate on syntax in French and inclusive writing and so on and so on. But in any case, this is at the beginning of the chapter on childhood. The chapter on childhood, of course, it's criticized sometimes by showing that it's what it describes as a very, very limited, specific experience of bourgeois education of girls, not valid everywhere, etc. But that's her experience. I mean, it's full of the dramatic dimension in the text comes clearly from the fact that it arises from her own experience, whether.
First person experience.
Sorry?
First person experience.
First person experience.
First person. Yeah, but first person written in the third person.
Yeah.
First person hiding behind the third person.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know, of course you know, the commentaries by Michel Ledeuf on the difference between Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre?
Yes.
Harsh against Sartre in, how is it called, her book? I have problems with titles. Okay, that's easy to...
Le Chardon et le Rouet.
Oh, yes, absolutely. L'écriture et le rouet. Hein?
L'écriture, ouais.
Writing and spinning. I drew a lot from her commentaries to have my external understanding of all that.
Yeah, there is a very nice essay by Manon Garcia, 2018, in French. On ne n'est pas soumise, on le devient. It's also very interesting.
On ne n'est pas what?
Soumise.
Soumise.
On le devient. So she draws from the Beauvoir's formula and well, into submission, and that's quite interesting as well. It's a great essay.
This is a very interesting formula, of course. That she had audience for that, I never tried to figure out. But undoubtedly, this is a kind of formula with speculative dimensions, but also extraordinary capacity to become replicated and used again in other with other reference. It's a very strong critical form of statement.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nathalie. Thank you. Hope you're.
I think we have time just for one last question here. Our very own Philip Golub.
So you have framed.
Be harsh. Be very
harsh.
Yes.
Well,
as much as you
happy to do. You have framed this discussion essentially today as about engagement as in two ways. First of all, you framed it essentially in the age of extremes.
In the age
of extremes.
Of extremes.
The type of and the age of extremes where engagement means the specific kinds of engagements of major intellectuals when they decided into the fray of history, and getting lost, many of them, in the process. One can also perhaps think of l'engagement at the moment where it actually begins as a moment of decision, because history forces that decision upon people one way or the other, that intellectuals, like other people, even though intellectuals are a class, a very special kind of caste and class of people, that history forces itself upon them too. In other words, upon us, yes. And that as ordinary people, as we call them ordinary people. I'm not sure why other people are ordinary people, but people who are not intellectuals, or who are not in positions of power, are also swept up by historical currents. And of course, the 20th century, the age of extremes, was a century in which people, intellectuals, people generally were swept up in forces of history that were entirely or mostly outside of their control, with the intellectuals having a slight advantage from the standpoint, from the perspective that intellectuals, by seeking to gain understanding of historical process, believe that they have some type of control over that process, whereas most people do not. So in that sense, they are subjected in much the same way as other people are subjected. What I'm suggesting here is that perhaps the 20th century is not necessarily the only frame within which we can discuss engagement. That there are different forms of engagement that do not take the Sartrean form, that do not take the form, obviously, of Heidegger and Schmidt, or on the other side of those who marched along with Brecht and the Communist Party. Today, there are other forms of engagement that perhaps are a different kind, that are also swept up and pushed by historical currents, such as the engagement of intellectuals and people in the struggle for the rights of migrants that you are engaged in your way. the struggle for the non-exclusion of the internal strangers within the nation, and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to your comments on that.
Yes, thank you very much. Again, perhaps this is my enormous mistake when I am in the discussion, but as in the case of Petar's question, I ask your permission to begin with a kind of qualification of what I had said. But that is called, I believe, by your very clear and important reference to the idea of the age of extremes. Because in the examples I was taking, or that you take again yourself, there's a terrible, and yes, I must have produced that impression in my auditor's mind. There's the enormous risk of suggesting that when you choose the extremes, this is because the extremes are given. Because they are given, and therefore it's the situation itself that creates, so to speak, this range or specter of positions where some are radical and others are conciliatory and liberal and so on, and therefore the heroic intellectual or the intellectual with capital I is of course not the one who chooses the juste milieu, but the one who, at the risk of catastrophic consequences, goes to the extreme. So it would not be Remoiron, but it would be Sartre and so on. Incidentally, it's interesting that Remoiron called his memoirs Le Spectateur Engagé, because he was trying to directly address the issues that I was mentioning it, and I have to. But because I don't have a ready-made doctrine, so I follow your suggestion, it occurs to me that we should also make room for another type of intellectual engagement, which I believe always involves also in a sense, a pure intellectual passion, but which is the attempt at radicalizing a position that seems to be a middle ground position. So there are extremists intellectual extremists among the liberals, not only among the fascists and the communists. And since today the landscape, so to speak, where intellectual projects and discourses and political, in that case, I would gladly translate it, of course, as commitment, have to merge and to meet is not the landscape of the 20th century. No doubts about that. The causes which are worth fighting and which involve those two risks I was talking about. One, to meet with obstacles, power structures, depending on where you are, of course, suppression and so on, but also being wrong, dramatically wrong, are to be found among the cases that you mentioned. Rights of the migrants, growth or non-growth as a solution to the environmental or degrowth, environmental catastrophe, which is not in the future, it's already there, and others. Of course, I'm especially sensitive to what you say about the. Did you say the strangers? The strangers. And I'm sure you agree with the fact that the English here has possibilities which the French completely lacks. That is to distinguish between or to articulate the question of the foreigner, the stranger, and the alien, and so on. So I'm a little diverting from, but one of the mottos that I try to ruminate, so to speak, and I know that not all the friends and I could say comrades or colleagues with whom I find myself advocating for the opening of borders or form that has to be defined, or above all, of course, in Aristotelian terms, granting the refugees and the migrants what they are absolutely denied, namely the right to have rights, and the right to defend their own rights. So this, of course, directly leads into criticizing the representation of the foreigner, stranger, alien that is dominant in our societies, even when they are liberal. But my conclusion from there is not that there should be no strangers. I am a reader of Zeman and others, and I believe that in a sense what we are desperately trying to do is save the stranger. Save the stranger, the possibility to be a stranger, to be, in whichever form, to whichever degree, in a society that claims to be liberal. That's the criterion after which its proclaimed liberalism should be measured. Is it still possible to be a stranger in our society? Not just a foreigner with a different passport, but a stranger that is somebody who is culturally, historically, and so on, different. So that the stranger does not, so this is where Kant touched something crucial, does not become automatically an enemy. But yes, I accept the idea that if that is your point, that the topography of extremes is not something that we should receive from the geopolitical
and from the 20th century, and from the 20th century.
From the 20th century.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I'm afraid our time is up. Thank you to everyone for
It's
joining.
me who want to thank you very, 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 very sincerely. I think all those who are there with us.
Well, thank you once again. We will give you, it will be a modest round of applause considering the number of people that attended. By the names, yes. And so thank you for that. We will end this event. I would have a question about the very early Marx and his attempts to reconcile, to deal with the questions of democracy, with Hegel's doctrine of the state, and how that moment of engagement following on his early journalistic writings was in some ways of a very different tenure than the major, when he's trying to replace the work of Hegel later on. But in any case, that will be for.
But I'm more and more convinced that Miguel Abasio, in his commentary on that text called La démocratie contre l'État, democracy against the state, has touched something very important about that text, which is it's precisely a radical democratic orientation beyond the liberal forms of representation. But then he stumbles on something which is nevertheless problematic, I believe, and which, because this is your subject. I mean, it's the interpretation of Marx's formula, the subject of the agent of the popular sovereignty is the whole people, das ganze Demos.
Yeah, the demos, every moment of the demos is a moment of itself as a whole.
Yes, as a whole. And because Abassur, who's a student of Le Friend, a student of Le Fort, believes, and I think rightly so, that the elimination of conflict, of intrinsic conflictuality from a definition of democracy is leads to totalitarianism. At the end of his commentary, he says there's nevertheless a problem with Marx. He seems to believe that perfect or complete democracy is one in which the conflictual dimension has been overcome or bypassed, whereas we should keep it there as an intrinsic characteristic of the demos itself. So for sure, this is not in the letter of Marx of what Marx had written.
Well, thank you. If we needed more proof that this conversation is never ending, there we go. Thank you once again to the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory at the University of Belgrade, Gazela, Draško, and Petar.
Thank you so much.